yeah.
Share the broadcast and see if you can post it to Daddy's page.
Okay. Can do that for me. All right.
And welcome to the David Mack Radio Show. No need to adjust your headsets. This is Daniel Mack and David James Mack IV, filling in for former Representative David Mack III. All is well. Just taking care of some things as usual. You know, life stays busy, but we bring blessings from him and Cheryl Mack as well. And again, we just thank you for joining us as you do on every Saturday at 1 p.m. on WJNI-FM. Before we get into a great show that we have scheduled today, because we got a special guest. He's always special, but definitely no stranger. We have Damon Fordham joining us today. And again, before we get into our topic, because it's going to be a lot to discuss, we want to make sure we have a whole lot this hour. We want to make sure that we get things to those who make sure that the David James Mack Radio Show is possible. So we want to get things starting off with Premier Medical Center. We always talk about all forms of your health, spiritual health, mental health, but it all starts with your physical health as well, too. So with your physical health, we say go to Premier Medical Center on 5390 Dorchester Road with Dr. Eni Akanafu. Just tell them the David Mack Radio Show sent you. Go see Dr. O. And again, that's Premier Medical Center, Primary Care Specialist, 5390 Dorchester Road. We also have the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce. When you speak of South Carolina and you also speak of Gullah people, you talk about a rich history of making sure that they live within their environment. And that's what the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce does. They look at commerce and making sure that we show respect for the environment, which is in the tradition of the Gullah Geechee people. They knew how to respect and live off the land. It was a relationship of sorts with the land. So we want to give thanks to Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce for all that they do and the support that they give. And last but not least, we have the Friends of Jim Clyburn. Again, with Friends of Jim Clyburn, they're making sure that the political process, democracy, is truly being practiced, making sure that they're giving out information, making sure people's rights are protected, making sure people are getting registered to vote, to participate in the political process. So that's something that's definitely along the lines of what we do. Remember, we can never tell you what to do. We just like to give you the information. Hopefully you can get your thoughts together from that and then participate in the process. At the end of the day, we can't make anyone change their mind. We just want people to think, know the truth, get facts, and then from there make their own decision. But in order for this political process to work, we all have to participate. That's where most dangers come from. And that is a good segue into what we're going to be discussing today, because one of the reasons that we brought Charleston, South Carolina, one of the nation's, I would say, top historians onto the air today is because history is at threat. I don't even know if that's possible, because the truth is never really a threat, but how that truth gets presented is definitely the case. There's been a lot of discussion recently about DeSantis and what's going on in Florida, and it's a whole lot going on. But what has come about, we know that how they have been treating critical race theory, and we've discussed that at length. But now it's come down that the Florida Board of Education says that right now they have curriculum that would teach that slavery had benefits to people as far as teaching skills. So again, there was a benefit to this free labor, and forget the free labor and the business part of it, but most of slavery was a psychological destruction in order to have make people into things in order to be that free labor. There was a psychological breakdown that was unlike any type of organized slavery seen in other parts of the world. But again, that's a whole nother discussion, and something that's never been into the textbooks at length. And now we're not only refusing to explore that, but at this point, if they're going to be mentioning slavery, mentioning the so-called benefits that slaves might have experienced at that particular time. So again, with this threat that we have coming up towards our history, we have Damon Fordham, and I just wanted to, I guess just start off again with history. And just basically all of your involvement in it. And I know that you've seen plenty of people try to revise history to their own ways or own whims or whatever it is that might be. And I just want to get your initial thoughts on this latest and largest, I'd probably say, because I feel like other states are going to try to follow suit, especially since this is a state that has a governor who's running for president. So again, president, he's trying to set a precedence possibly for how we teach going forward. So what are your initial thoughts?
Well, first of all, this is nothing new. Let me just start off by discussing that aspect of it. Because you see, first of all, to take this matter far back, you had what was called the Reconstruction era, which few Americans know about today for the following reason. The Reconstruction era was the period from 1865 to 1877, where after the end of slavery, the federal government tried to reform the southern United States by passing 3 constitutional amendments. The 13th Amendment in 1865 ended slavery throughout the country. The 14th Amendment in 1868 said that all persons born here were citizens. And the 15th Amendment said that all men born here had the right to vote. Women would get that in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So this led to a lot of things that were censored from the history books for reasons I'm going to get into a little bit later here. It led to such things as the fact that in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1872, you had the first African-American governor. His name was Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, and he was the founder of Southern University in Baton Rouge, which is one of the larger black colleges in America today. You had 2 black lieutenant governors in South Carolina during that period, Alonzo Jacob Ransier from 1870 to 1872, and Richard Howard Lees from 1872 to 1877. The University of South Carolina was integrated temporarily from 1873 to 1877, not only with black students, but black female students. One of them, Celia Dow Saxton, a teacher who was born in slavery in Columbia in 1857, died in 1935 while grading papers. She recently had a dormitory named after her at the University of South Carolina. And the school was desegregated in the 1870s while all this was happening. Here in Charleston, from January to April of 1868, 76 blacks and 48 whites gathered at what's now the Julius Waites Royal Judicial Center to bring about the most progressive constitution seen in America's history up to that time, called the Declaration of Rights. They called for all discrimination laws to be taken off the books, for women to be allowed to divorce abusive husbands. There would be state hospitals and mental institutions, and best of all, the great Robert Smalls, the man who fled from his family in slavery and took the Confederate ship, the Planter, and sailed him out of Charleston Harbor into freedom. He got up at that convention on January the 23rd, 1868, and said, resolved, all children between the ages of 7 and 14 must attend public school but for 6 months a year under penalty of noncompliance. So why don't most people know that? The following reasons. Because the Reconstruction era was such a threat to the power structure. The wealthy class of whites of South Carolina had deepest fear was that the poor whites in their poverty and illiteracy and subjugation would find common cause with their black brethren and come together to overthrow the rule of the wealthy class of whites. So basically they indoctrinated the poor whites with the belief that if blacks had equality, they would be relegated to the bottom of society. In simple terms, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. So, December 24th, 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee at the courthouse, 6 Confederate veterans founded the Resistance Army against the Reconstruction era. They named themselves after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. And that's how the Ku Klux Klan started. For the next 12 years, bloodshed reigned throughout the South. Memphis Massacre of 1866, New Orleans Massacre of 1866, Meridian, Mississippi Massacre of 1871, Colfax, Louisiana Massacre of 1873, Clinton, Mississippi Massacre of 1875, Hamburg, South Carolina Massacre of 1876, Ellington, South Carolina Massacre of 1876, and November the 8th, 1876, right on Broad Street, blacks and whites shot it out in the middle of Broad Street. You notice I said blacks and whites shot it out, contrary to popular belief. Black people weren't just going to the churches and crying and praying until Martin Luther King and Malcolm X came along. they were shooting back and taking names while all this was happening. The federal government said, yo, this is too much. We can't have this mess anymore. Let's just give the South what it wants. So February 1877, they passed the Tilden-Hayes Compromise that ended Reconstruction. Now, here's where all this comes in. One of the byproducts of that was that Mildred Rutherford of the Daughters of the Confederacy went on a national campaign to excise what I just told you out of the history books to, quote, bring this country back together again, and should they replace that with pro-Confederate history, okay? From this period up until 1984, the textbooks in South Carolina were the Mary Sims Oliphant textbooks that came out, which taught, among other things, that the Ku Klux Klan brought order back to the southern states, that the black people were ignorant and happy with slavery and so forth. No mention of the greatness and the heroism and the intelligence of black leadership with people like Celia Dial Saxton, Robert Smalls, William J. Whipper, a black lawyer on on Broad Street, who tried to fight against segregation being made in the state constitution in 1895. None of this stuff was known to the average person except for those of us professional bookworms that like to go into the libraries and look up these things, right? So therefore, generations of people believed that the Confederacy was not about slavery and that slavery was a beneficial thing. And you see where that got the country. That stopped in South Carolina in 1984 when Governor Richard Riley had the Education Improvement Act, which said that this type of history should be taught in 3rd and 8th grade social standards. I was on the committee that examined that in 2000, you see. So this all goes to show, as the Spanish philosopher Jorge Santayana said at Harvard University in 1896, those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
And you just had the law dropped to you by Damon Fordham, again, historian, author, lecturer, everything. And this is what's important. All these things are based from what you just mentioned. It just seems like everything is based on the history of trying to keep information away from people. So either they don't know their strength or they don't know the root cause of all this turmoil. If you can just keep people in chaos, keep them fighting, they might not see the grand picture that, again, it's more than just racism. This is classism as well.
Well, race is used to disguise a lot of these things, you see, because, you know, it doesn't take a whole lot of education to look at the issue of race. But when you start looking deeper into things, which is exactly what the people like this do not want to be done, you start upsetting the economic apple cart. Because, again, this was done so that the poor whites and blacks wouldn't see how much they had in common. Now, let me get real for you for a moment. You go to North Charleston. You go to these country Walmarts throughout Mississippi and Georgia and places like that, and you'll see that poor white people and southern black people got way more in common than anybody cares to admit. And so the idea of these two actually realizing that commonality and coming together against the people in office who are keeping them both down is something a lot of people traditionally have not wanted to happen. So therefore, this is why they do that sort of divide and conquer, which is what racism is really all about.
And one thing that I always found interesting is that these were people who knew this system because they escaped from it within the UK by coming to the United States, forming this, and then they did the same structures like, but hey, we're just going to have export being our trade, or basically our trade and our slave labor at this point, and then it just reworked our whole system. But of course, here we are now in this melting pot. Things are different, and now it seems like we're trying to revert back to that. And before I hand everything over to DJ, I just wanted to ask one more question because I know he's got tons of questions as well.
Sure, that's why I'm here. Let's hear it.
But ultimately, with this current move by the state of Florida, one thing that's always interesting to me is that I feel that ultimately when things like this happen, people, when you try to take something away from someone, that's when they actually start to delve into it. So organizations start to say, you can't do this. It usually piques people's interest into, why don't you want us to know about that? Have you noticed that effect? And do you think that that can actually have a positive effect on the actual society? Outside of politics and what school boards and everything that they do you think that individuals and households are going to start to say, well, if there's such a ruckus, I need to look into this myself?
Yes, but there's a problem with that. The problem with that is that most people in our society today do not know how to separate good information from bad information. Many people do not know how to look at something on the internet and distinguish it from what is factual and what is not. When you have a situation where 71 Americans are willing to vote for a man who called for revolution against his own country just a couple of years ago and saw it live on television as it took place, and they're still willing to vote for that man, that tells you that we are seriously, and I'm just going to be blunt about this, we are living in ignorant times. That's just the plain truth of the matter. And we have to help people to understand that when you look at something on the internet, just because it appeals to your emotions, that doesn't make it factual. What you have to do is do what's called cross-referencing, which is check the sources to see where that person got that information. If it can't be documented, you have to leave it alone. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that. Now, as you both probably know, I just got back from my second trip from Africa, okay? And there are people on the internet spouting foolishness, brainwashing our young people with the ignorant idea that we were not originally from Africa. And I'm sure some of y'all have heard some of this foolishness before, right? That slavery didn't really happen, that Harriet Tubman was a fictional character, and that we're some mess called foundational Americans or some nonsense that we were here before the Native Americans, and just stuff that has no basis in history, right? But these clowns know good and well that you have a lot of these young people who did not have the good fortune that you two and I did of having parents that knew real history and encouraged us to read books. Unfortunately, with the crack epidemic in about 20 or 30 years ago, and that older generation like that dying out, a lot of these young people just didn't have all of this. So therefore, you have these clowns and these crooks on YouTube putting out all this false information that are leading our youth into a quagmire of ignorance. And when I came back, and when I was at the University of Gambia in Banjul, West Africa, I told them when I got back to America, I'm going to tell the truth about Africa, okay? And even when I show some of these people the truth, see, when you deal with a person who was not raised in an educated environment, and they are in error, and you show them that they're in error, they're not going to respond right away. They are embarrassed that they fell for ignorance, so they're going to get defensive and dig in their heels a lot of times. But my thing about that is that's okay, because guess what? I planted that seed, and I may not live to see that seed grow and develop, but at least you can't say that I didn't plant it there.
Wow, that's just so powerful and very much needed. And this is David Mack, the fourth DJ, right here, just saying thank you as always. And it's always a pleasure to speak to you. My question has a lot to do. Well, first of all, backing up to that the history that you gave and the history that you were able to share with all of us. What can we in our community do to make sure that this information reaches the future generations? It was always interesting working in a I would say a more diverse. I don't know how diverse the offices and communities are, but just being in an environment where I had a chance to talk to a lot of different people, and I saw where you had communities who, whether it was the Jewish community, Greek community, Italian community, Russian community, there was always an investment internally in their education, making sure they knew their stories, their traditions.
Yes.
It might be done religiously. It might be done through family get-togethers or reunions, traditions, whatever the case may be. There was always this direct lineage or thread, if you will, that the whole that each culture had that was woven throughout this country. But people in our community, the Black community, don't have the same thing, and if anything, it was taken away. So there's been a big push, and I've seen this on social media. We've also had personal discussions about, well, we need to take our education into our own hands and teach and be responsible for teaching our own children this information. What do you feel about that? How do you feel about that?
All right, two things. Number one, I worked with the Jewish Community Center for a number of years, and it's true that they passing down a lot of this stuff. But see, here's what happened with the African-American situation. You see, first of all, a lot of our parents were deliberately undereducated to see to it that they were maintained as a permanent class of cheap labor, okay? So a lot of the times the kids grew up without this type of thing. And as far as passing things down, one of two things happened. You had situations like mine and yours. And I read in Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, one of the best leaders of our day, he said in his recent book, The Third Reconstruction, that he would sit and listen while his father would talk to their friends. And the other people would say, hey, man, this kid doesn't need to hear all this. And his father would say, he's getting his education, he's learning. That did not happen in many homes, because whereas my dad saw to it that I understood a lot of this history, he had actually heard Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the founder of Black History Month and the Association and Study of Negro Life and History back in the day. He heard him speak at the South Carolina State back in 1943. And he passed down a lot of those kind of teachings down to me. And I read Ebony magazine in the house when I was a boy and all that. So, and I read Langston Hughes' Pictorial History of the Negro in America, not in my classroom, but at the library in my classroom, okay? But see, I was a bookworm that was bad at sports, and that was considered unusual back in those days, okay? So what you had in a lot of other homes was that the parents, when they would get into discussions about things, they would tell the children, this is grown folks talk, you don't need to hear this, right? So there wasn't that much of passing down of things, and a lot of what happened to them in their past was so bitter that they didn't want to relive that. So when the parents died, the children didn't know the history. And then to make matters worse, as I said earlier, you had very few schools and educators teaching this type of thing. You got it at a place like, say, the Avery Institute, or if you were at Burke and you had a teacher like Dr. Eugene Hunt or something like that, you were fortunate, but not every place had that, you see. So then when, you had the crack epidemic and all that come in the 80s and 90s, the generation who lived through and knew all those things, a lot of them passed away. So there was no one out there to really teach these young people and show them where to go to get the right information. So to say, well, let's teach our kids now, you can't teach what you don't know yourself. So we have to work on getting the parents themselves educated on these things. That is, those of us who know this stuff and not following a lot of these characters on YouTube with no credentials and just making up things and all that. They have to read and study people like Dr. Henry Louis Gates, a man who I'm proud and honored to say is a friend and mentor of mine. People like your dad, David Mack III, and the things that you got from your grandfather, David Mack Jr., and people such, and legitimate historians with credentials, okay? They have to look at things like that before they can get up there and teach the children. Otherwise, you have Ray Charles leading Stevie Wonder down the street. And the New Testament teaches us when the blind leadeth the blind, they falleth in the ditch. Next question.
So that's just so powerful. You said something earlier, though, that I want to really bring back. And this is something that I know that has been a narrative within our community, but it's definitely getting worse as we move on. You mentioned something about being a bookworm, so to speak, and that's very important. And now the context of that is that we live in a time now where almost being educated or being smart or being a bookworm is not only looked upon, but there's this narrative that is acting white, is acting educated.
Oh, I had that when I was a kid in the 70s.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but in the context of this conversation, it's so interesting because the very information that you're trying to instill actually can defeat that very narrative. There's a lot of misinformation. There are sports, whether you talk about inventions, traditions, things that people, minorities, Black people have essentially donated, invented, brought to this society that we now label, oh, you don't do that. That's what white people do, or that's a white people thing, or that's what white people are interested in. And it's exactly the opposite. We've become, and I'm saying collectively, we've come to this place to where we have been so miseducated or at least undereducated about our own past that we're not able to effectively deal with a reality now. We actually curse the very education that we're looking to protect. So just is a very sensitive topic, but can you just really build on that? And how do we
how do we internally build the importance of not just education, but education about ourselves, and how to project and understand that education is important and not looked at as a form of acting white or being a part of the establishment or being aligned with the man.
Okay, let me take that on several levels and go back to how what you just described came up in the first place, okay? You see, back in 1895, you had the segregation constitution established in South Carolina that threw out the progressive constitution that I talked about a little bit earlier. And the great Robert Smalls, along with William J. Whipper, Thomas Miller, the founder of South Carolina State University, James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, two black lawyers from Beaufort, South Carolina, and Robert Anderson, a black teacher from Georgetown. This is all in my current book, The 1895 Segregation Fight in South Carolina. These men eloquently fought against that segregation law. And one of the things that a white delegate from Berkeley County named William Henderson said was that if black people keep learning to read and write faster than the whites, that they will overtake us educationally. So that's one of the reasons this miseducation was done, in order to see to it that that didn't happen. So I say all that to tell young people that when you become educated and smart and all of that, you're basically giving the best weapon you can to fight racism and the enemies of our people is in the library, as well as listening to the wiser of our elders. Now, having said all of that, one of the things that fascinated me about Africa, and I know everybody can't go to Africa, but those of us who do have a responsibility to educate people back here about this, is that yes, there's a lot of poverty, and yes, there's some things going on that's not right, but that's true with everywhere. But one of the beautiful things about Africa is that they know who they are. A child over there can tell you what tribe they are, okay? There are these two sweet little girls over there, Sally and Khadija Kasama, who call me Uncle Damon when I'm over in Gambia, right? And they showed me a picture of their great-great-granddaddy, who was the chief of the Mandinkas of Gambia, okay? There's another young lady, those who follow me on my social media page know about Kaidiba, who works at the museum in Dakar, okay? She is of the Wolof people, and she can pass for my little sister, basically. And the Wolof people over there basically adopted me as a tribesman because I look so much like them and share their characteristics. She showed me a picture in the museum of her great-great-grandmother, Queen Mbodj, if I recall correctly, who was so much of a revolutionary against the French colonizers that they had to chase her in a hut and burn the hut down in order to stop her from revolting. But shortly before that, she had children that became her ancestors, this young Kaidiba person, okay? These people know who they are. And you see the difference when you see the dignity in the Africans who know who they are. They know who their tribes are and where they came from and all that sort of thing. Now, of course, a lot of that was cut out from us, but we can make an effort to learn legitimately about what they have over there and so forth, and take that to understand that, as Malcolm X said to an audience in Los Angeles, California, February 5th, 1962, you could never do anything until you realize that you did something. And that's why we have to teach this stuff. So what I do so one of the things that I do is I take this message, and unlike a lot of other academics, I put this in a language that the average Jane and the average Joe could understand. And I don't try to get all academic on people. I speak in simple, plain terms. Recently, I was at a forum where some people who were in my profession were talking. And this one guy, who's just an average, everyday Joe, he asked something about slaves, right? And one of the academians got there, "Sir, we no longer say slaves, we say enslaved Africans." I'm like, what the hell wrong with you, man? Come on. These are average, everyday people. Let them express themselves, okay? Leave that academic nonsense that only matters to you in academia where it belongs. When you speak to the average person, you speak in the language that the average person can understand, and you engage them. All that nonsense does is just push people away. And academians just don't get that. So that's why I consider what I try to do to be a link between the community of the scholarly community as well as the average Jane, the average Joe. Because see, the scholars, they got theirs. I'm not worried about them. I'm worried about the average Jane, the average Joe, the average Pookie, the average Ray, the average Bonquisha on the corner. That's who I care about, who learns this stuff, because those are the ones who need it, and you can't teach them and push them away at the same time.
And before we go any further, I want to give a thanks, because one of the things that DJ and I were discussing earlier this week when this went down, and of course with you being a professor as well, I count you as this, but anyone who goes out and is a teacher, professor, anyone who's willing to go out and put a passion behind their education, make sure people are actually getting the truth. And I was thinking back to 5th grade, I was blessed with 2 outstanding teachers, Mrs. Dawson and Mrs. Etheridge, who, even with that group, and I honestly love them with all my heart, but I just remember at the time, and again, I don't know if we'll ever see that again, watching documentaries about the civil rights, Eyes on the Prize, things that did not hold back. And they were showing that to us at that young age, and I'm thankful for it. But other than that, there was not a lot of exposure in school, period. The first time I saw Malcolm X was in a rap video for self-destruction at age 7. I never saw him in a textbook. Again, this is a major part of American history. And then as I think about it, it wasn't that long ago, because being in the 80s and 60s, we always had that time period. But I'm thinking that, maybe it was so long ago. Maybe my books missed it. And then I get older and I realize that, that gap was not that large. It was just omitted. So ultimately, I'm thankful for those teachers who make sure that even if it's uncomfortable, knowing that you just have to teach the truth. And then that's how people really get educated. If you give them cookie cutter material, they're going to have a cookie cutter education and have a cookie cutter life and policies and so forth. So ultimately, when it comes to the teachers, those on the front line, the educators, the professors, and so on, or what responsibilities, again, with you being a part of that field as well, what responsibility do you feel educators should have when we know that policies like this and also curriculum like this is coming down from, not only Florida, but possibly other states in the future?
Several things. Now, remember when we went down to Birmingham, Alabama in 1999 for the documentary?
Never forget that trip.
And we met the ladies who were in the choir at the 16th Street Baptist Church that was blown up in Birmingham and all that. And we met a whole lot of people who are now dead that lived through all those things. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? Now, since you saw all those things and you were exposed to all those things, it's your responsibility to use your platform to go to young people and explain this in a language that they understand. You mentioned Malcolm X. When I was 10 years old, WPAL radio back in the day, they would play Malcolm X speeches along with Dr. King and Reverend C.L. Franklin out of Detroit, who was Aretha's daddy, by the way.
And that's a lot of good stuff that you can look up on. If you're looking up stuff on YouTube, get that stuff from there.
That's right. And they had the Muhammad Speaks program on there also with the young Minister Farrakhan and folks like that. I would listen to this when I was a boy, when we came back from church, along with the gospel music. They would play things like this. And I took a lot of this stuff like a sponge, basically. And so that played a part in my development, all right? So therefore, since all these things and listening to these wise old people and all that, one of Esau Jenkins' son, James, used to teach with my dad at Lang High School back when I was a boy, as a matter of fact, right? Mm-hmm. And for those of you who watching this who don't know what I'm talking about, Esau Jenkins was sort of like the Charleston area's version of Martin Luther King. And if you talk to your elders, every city had people like that, okay? In Columbia, there was Mother Majeska Simpkins, who I had the opportunity of knowing as a young man when I was in college there. In Columbia, in Spartanburg, my birthplace, there was the Reverend Booker T. Sayers and others like them. Everywhere you go, you had people like that, and I had the honor of getting to know people like this, okay? And so, therefore, it is now my responsibility to take what I learned from those people and put it out there to these people. That's why I don't just stay in the ivory tower at the Citadel and teach classes there. I go out on YouTube. I go out on shows like this. I go out in the streets. I see people. I talk to them and all that. What I do is if you've ever seen the Disney cartoon about Johnny Appleseed, how he used to go around the country throwing these apple seeds. And even though he didn't live to see it, all these apple orchards bloomed by the time he was older and his people didn't starve. Well, that's what I'm trying to do with these things. Take all these things I was fortunate enough to get these aspects of and go to spread it around, plant the seeds among the youth so that as they grow up, they can do something constructive with that and put the day that America falls to the level of ancient Rome, because as with every great empire, as the scientist Sir Isaac Newton said, what goes up must go down. Put that in that part where we go down further into the future. Now, as for constructive solutions, the ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, right now in Florida as we speak, they're setting up freedom schools. So the association, these are people who are professionals who study African American history, okay? So they're taking what they do out to these young people, out to churches, community centers, and places like that. And if they don't get it in school, they're giving it to them there. So when the younger people get older, they can take that and do the same thing and pass it on down. So that's one of the solutions.
And one other thing I just wanted to attack with this, because again, for anyone who's just joining, this is the David Mack Radio Show. We're joined by Damon Fordham, a historian, author, lecturer, activist. No stranger to the show, and he's been dropping information in history for us, as always, that only the way in which he can. And before we continue with this conversation, I just wanted to I wanted to continue with this part of the conversation, basically with schools, since ultimately that's what's at risk. And again, for us, I feel that, so far it's been a blessing where if you have any connection to your elders, some of that history has been coming back, or we talk about our people, and it is weird. We have a new connection among each other, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, but we do have this connection to information like we've never had before. And so even with this change coming in schools, there's just a certain way you can just fact check certain things. Now, again, that in itself is a process, because you do have to check your source. But for anyone who wants to do it, you can still do it exponentially easier than going through, say, multiple libraries, as one may have had to do in the past, or ordering books waiting for the ride. A lot of this is at your fingertips, and a lot of it is for free as well. So ultimately, do you see this playing a role? And again, there's some dangers to it, because when you talk about false information, and with the advent of AI, you want to talk about
artificial intelligence.
Someone who can expertly rewrite history if someone doesn't have a keen eye. But ultimately, what role do you see technology and this access for information playing a role? Because that moves faster than any school board or any school district that we have in this country right now. So again, it's a challenging aspect and can't really stay ahead of this technology. But what role do you think it will play?
Technology can be either used for good or evil. Let me put that out there right now, okay? Okay, right now, as we speak, there's this movie about Robert Oppenheimer, who invented nuclear energy. The nuclear energy could be used for good, as far as giving some sort of alternative to gasoline and things like that. And it could be used for the evil of the destruction of nuclear warfare, okay? Mm-hmm. Computer technology is the same way. It could be used for good, for legitimately educating people, and it can be used for the wrong means by putting up propaganda and nonsense to influence the emotionalism of people who have never been taught how to sensibly dissect facts from foolishness. And so what we have to do is explain to people this. If you want to deal with factual information, so the best thing you got to do is not just go by your emotions. You look up, where did this person get that information? And you keep working backwards. Now, the best thing to do is not just Google, because newsflash, Google alone is not research in itself, okay? Not just Googling is not the best way to do it. There's a thing called Google Scholar that you can look up, where you can find legitimate information by experts on the subject, because this can get very dangerous. Right now, you have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a man whose father was one of the true greats in American history, and his son is nothing like that. The son is spreading propaganda about vaccines when he himself doesn't know jack about science, which endangers the lives of many people. So fortunately, he made this very crude comment about how the COVID virus doesn't affect Jews and Chinese people and was designed to affect white people and African Americans. Well, for one thing, I thought a lot of Jews were Caucasian to begin with, but that's another conversation. But still, when he made that totally ignorant statement, fortunately, the Democratic Party was almost at a point where 20% were willing to support this man making these foolish, asinine statements. And when he said that bit of foolishness, they dropped down to 9%. And I hope it gets even lower than that. Now, the fact that people paid attention to somebody saying things like that in the first place shows you how far we have fallen as a nation. That because I said earlier how many people are willing to support a former president who basically called for a revolution against his own nation. And you have people in the Democratic Party who call themselves educated supporting somebody like that. This is how much work we need to do in educating the public, period, and how to find good information versus bad information as to what appeals to your emotions.
Excellent.
Yeah, that is so helpful, really helpful information. I would love if you could just for the listeners repeat. You mentioned it earlier about one of the solutions, the name of the organization that's working with the church. Oh yes,
the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH as it's commonly known. It was formed under Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who was the founder of Black History Month, is originally called Negro History Week back in the 1920s. And while I'm on that subject, contrary to popular belief, Black History Month was not given to Black people because it was the shortest and coldest month. Let me throw that out there right now, because every year I have to tell people about that foolishness. The fact of the matter is, you see, because of the bitterness of our experiences, so many people are inclined to believe negativity of what they hear, even if the truth is actually far more positive than that. Dr. Carter G. Woodson started that in 1926 in order so that we could learn more about real history, okay? So the Association for the Study of African American Life History, which incidentally I used to be the local chapter president in the early 2000s, they are embarking upon a program in Florida where they are using town halls, churches, and vacant buildings, that sort of thing, to teach young people and anybody who else is interested real African American history, okay? So that they could, so that if the schools are derelict in their duty in doing this, they will have that backup plan the same way that in the Jewish community you have Sabbath schools where the young Jewish people are taught their history, you see. But unfortunately, a lot of our adults can't do that. So we have to work on the adults to where they will know to leave these YouTube charlatans that are feeding them foolishness alone and go to legitimate historians like Dr. Henry Louis Gates and Dr. William Marvin Delaney, who used to be my boss at the Avery Institute. He's now the national president of the Association for the Study of African American Life History. You know, things like that with legitimate historians. And I have a YouTube channel myself called The American Storyteller. In every video I do, I tell you the source of where I got the information so that you can check it for yourselves. And I'm not just making up stuff about how slavery didn't exist or how Harriet Tubman was a fictional character or how we didn't come from Africa, but were, quote, indigenous to this land and all that with no sources, making it up out of thin air and all of that. I'm not doing that. I'm giving you checks and receipts so that you could look this up to see if I'm talking about something that exists or just making up out of thin air in order to take advantage of the bitterness of the people, which is something I refuse to do.
The reason why I thought, and really I'm so glad that you were able to really hone in, tell us more about the organization, the great work that they're doing. The reason why it's so important, especially the way that I look at it, is because it's really almost a two-sided or a two-tiered problem. There's the problem of education within our own community, learning our history, our traditions, our past and culture and so forth. But then on the other side, there's the lack of education and the lack of awareness for whites and other cultures who don't know anything about our culture. So what happens is that you have an ongoing enemy because you have two groups that have access to different information, already have different experiences, come from totally different perspectives, but then you want to throw them into the workforce and then have them understand each other. Have them, oh, well, this is your coworker, so and so. I don't know anything about your culture, and then you don't know anything about mine. So now we have issues. You say something, I take it the wrong way. I mean, we're talking about, and this is something I really feel very strongly about, because we look at education, especially high school, college, or even higher ed, in this vacuum of just of academia, or just learning facts. But we don't see how important that is with respect to how we work, our everyday society, and how we actually get along. So if you could address that part.
I am so glad
if you could address
just
that
said
part,
that.
I'd appreciate it.
I'm glad you said that. A couple of things I want to say about this. Number one, Governor DeSantis and others like this say that warn against teaching this type of history will, quote, make white kids feel bad about themselves. Let me address that. That statement like that shows ignorance, because it's a true understanding of this type of history will show you that, yes, there were white people who were bigots, but you had people like Judge Julius Waties Waring here in Charleston, a white judge who was run out of town in 1952 because of his advocacy of civil rights. You had Viola Liuzzo, the white lady who came down here down to Selma, Alabama from Detroit, who was killed helping Martin Luther King register black people to vote. You had Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, who came down from Brooklyn, two Jewish fellows who came down to Meridian, Mississippi to help a young black man named James Chaney help people to register and vote. You had the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, two white women who were run out of Charleston in 1835 for trying to end slavery. An honest understanding of this history will show you that while they were white bigots, yes, you had white people who were helpful in that black and who would give the modern people of the day a true understanding of real anti-racism instead of the nonsense that passes for it to now, which I'm going to get into momentarily. Now, on the other side of that, some African Americans are pushing what I call the victimhood narrative, that all we did was suffer under these people and never did anything for our own behalf until Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Rosa Parks and all that. That's a lie. Number one, not only did you have slave rebels like Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Maria W. Stewart, and David Walker, and numerous others like that, you also had, now people talk about Tulsa, right? Everybody talks about how the white community burned out the blacks in Tulsa. What's not taught is that there was a black lawyer named B.C. Franklin who sued the city of Tulsa because they wanted to take the black people's burnt land and build it for white people. He said no and took it to court and won, and those black people rebuilt Black Wall Street. So much so that when Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois came to Tulsa in 1926, he said, "Tulsa, I bow my head to you." And while that community was being burned, black World War I veterans, led by Mr. O.B. Mann, took out their shotguns and did what they could to defend their community until they were outnumbered and outgunned. Whenever you had these massive race riots, black people fought back and shot back. And long before Marcus Garvey or Malcolm X was born, you had Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, who my grandfather was named after, by the way, who told black people that when the lynchers come to you, you meet them with a shotgun. And he also said that he also was leading black people back to Africa long before Marcus Garvey was born. Dr. Andre Johnson, a friend of mine at Memphis State University, just wrote a book about him, okay? So this stuff is there, but a lot of the people who know this don't communicate with the masses who need it. Because right now, a very popular book is out there making our history look like we were nothing but victims. And it's written, by the way, largely by a black woman who claimed that she wrote it like that to encourage reparations. Okay, it's not going to work like that, because a book like that will do nothing but make people think that their situation is hopeless. And people who without hope do not fight because they will see no reason to fight to begin with. Mm-hmm. So that's why that kind of teaching is dangerous. And that's why it's important to teach the whole story that, yes, African Americans fought back, and yes, they were true white allies, and not these folks running around calling themselves woke and going around saying all this pretentious language, thinking that that's going to solve the problem. No. I tell all these young people who run around call themselves woke this. If you have no centralized solid leadership, if you have no game plan or strategy, and if you have no clear, coherent goal that you're going to meet in the end analysis, you do not have a movement, you have confusion.
if you're listening, and we have this recorded. We have it on Facebook Live. We have it here at the radio station. Please, if not for anything, that last statement is very, very important, not just to this topic of education, but everything moving forward. There is a lot of confusion, just as what you were saying with Google, people being able to look up and find certain information from uncredited scholars everywhere to who's
pseudo scholars.
Pseudo scholars. Yes, exactly. Pseudo scholars. But I wanted to say, to get your opinion on where do you think the direction is going? We're starting to wind down. Daniel's going to close it out, but I wanted to know, if you look at the recent legislation that was passed that allows money or people to use public vouchers for private schools. You look at what's happening with critical race theory in Governor DeSantis, and even in other states, this very state, Texas, and some others. And then you look at what's happened recently with affirmative action and so forth. Do you think that we are moving back to a pre Dr. Thurgood Marshall era where schools are separate and unequal? Do you think we are headed back to that era?
That is up to us. It's as simple as that. Those of us who know better, those of us who know how to reach the people, those of us who know how to plant those seeds and read the tea leaves of what's going on, it's up to us. And those of you who are watching this and listening to this, this is up to you. 3 words: fight the foolishness with the facts, okay? First, you got to find the facts, all right? And you got to study what the great leaders of the past have done in order to fight these situations, and take that and adapt that to the needs and the methodology of the 2020s, okay? Dr. Martin Luther King's last book was called Where Do We Go From Here? It had instructions on what to do next after the struggle for voting rights and against segregation is won. But few people read it at the time, because in those days, the voices of stridency drowned out the voices of reason. But Dr. William Barber, who I think is probably one of the closest modern equivalents to Martin Luther King, he uses that book as his handbook. You find the writings of great teachers, the W.E.B. Du Bois, the Henry McNeil Turners, the Shirley Chisholms, the Booker T. Washingtons, the Frederick Douglasses, and all of that. Look at this and look at the modern situation. Ask yourselves, what would they do? And adapt all of these things to the modern situation, right? So remember earlier I said that if you don't have solid leadership or a solid game plan or a solid coherent goal, you don't have a movement, you have confusion, then use what you learned from these things to adapt it to modern times, and use that information to fight what you see going on today. Because as I said earlier, with the Spanish philosopher Jorge Santayana, those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. You have to have the greatest weapon that you could have to fight against that, which is your mind.
And just speaking with your mind as we get to these last few minutes, you kind of did it in a sense, but really just want to hone on it as far as people move forward and you're thinking about, man, we don't know where the education is going to go. We have parents wondering, what are my kids getting exposed to while they're in school, or what is education going to look like? Again, to what DJ was saying, as far as if you have people getting different histories taught, when it's time for them to work together towards something as a goal, how is that going to work together? If we have these particular challenges, just again, something for people to focus on.
Two things. First of all, if you are a parent and you don't know this history, there's something you can do. Now, I know they're banning a lot of this stuff from the school libraries and all that, but you can order any book you want from a bookstore or online. So what you do is you go to your local bookstore and ask them, what books are age appropriate for my child to learn this history? And let them let them guide you into what books you can use for that. And if they don't have it, they can order those books for you, okay? That's one thing you can do. Now, I used to be involved with this group called Operation Understanding, which the young Clay Middleton, who's running for mayor now, I taught him in that program, among others, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where you got the young groups together to where they could learn about each other's differences. It was a Black and Jewish youth group, right? and they remain friends even today, 30 years after the fact in many cases, right? So young people can, after they learn things like this, they can basically form study groups where they can get together and discuss and hash out these things in an intelligent fashion. And those two ways, I think, would help take care of the two things that you just described. For every problem, there is a solution if you look hard enough.
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, with the episode that we've had today, we've been addressing what's been going on in Florida. The Florida Board of Education has recently approved curriculum saying that basically there's a portion in it that just says that there is a benefit to slavery, such as learning new skills that could be used. I don't know, those are some of the key words that were pulled out. But ultimately, this is causing an uproar. And for that particular state, it's something where it has to go to each of their school districts to see what curriculum they actually are going to approve. And
yes, I've downloaded the Florida Academic Social Studies Standards for anybody who wants to read this. This is easily available online. You can look up the Florida standards and see for yourself what this type of thing is doing. So it's there for anybody who wants to see it, okay?
Absolutely. And again, why this information is important is because right now with Florida, you have to think, Florida's always a major player in presidential elections. Right now with DeSantis, he is actually running for president right now. He's actually doing a lot of things just, again, possibly suing Anheuser-Busch for transgender ads. It's a lot going on. But again, this is part of that play for, this is how they want their particular society to look. And if he becomes president, there's going to be a push for the nation to possibly fall in step with this type of information. And the thing is, it's to me more than anything else, if anything else, no matter where you may fall as far as race, class, or anything else, I feel as a human being, we all have this thing where we don't like being lied to. And that's why I don't understand how, as we bring this to a close, probably just a last thought, again, with ignorance is one thing, but when you start to love the ignorance, you start to almost be addicted to it. Like almost like I'm glad I don't know. Or even if you show something to them and they again, it's a mindset that's becoming out there that we have to actually war against. But I guess just one last closing thought against, a love for truth in this fight against ignorance, because at the heart of it, that's where it lies. People don't like being lied to, but they've been so hurt. It's almost like they're starting to buy into it.
Actually, I disagree with that, because here's the thing. If you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you that you have a choice between drinking a lot of sugary soda and drinking health drinks, the average person is still going to want to drink their soda regardless, okay? But you have to understand this. Sometimes it is not always good to go by gut instinct and what makes you feel good, because what makes you feel good is not always good for you. Keep that in mind.
Very strong words that we have there. And you just want to make sure with this last discussion as we bring it to a close. Again, I have a feeling that we'll be discussing this in great terms at length as this continues to go on, because this is just the beginning of it, and we have to see how the state of Florida is going to continue to fight it. But any last words in regards to this as well?
No, just always an honor to have Professor Fordham on the show, and just to be able to speak to our listeners and talk about this in a very real way going forward. You said something really dynamic about being able to speak to people. They always say meet people where they are.
Yes, you have to do that.
Meet people where they are,
That's right.
And that's very important. You have a lot of people within our group, our society, that look down on people who might be uneducated or might not use proper language, inarticulate. That is very important.
But they do the best they can with what they have.
They do the best they can with what they
Meet
have.
them where they are.
That's a very, very important message that you brought here today, sir, and I really, really appreciate that.
And Brother Damon Fordham, we thank you. Again, author, historian, lecturer, just everything. We thank you for everything that you brought to the show. And again, the biggest thing I feel we can take from this is that we have a whole lot more in common if the history is out there and told to the people. So that's why it shouldn't be restricted. On behalf of David Mack III, Cheryl Mack, Brandon Shaw, David James Mack IV, Damon Fordham, and myself, we thank you for joining us this Saturday. Please join us again next Saturday on WJNI-FM at 1 o'clock. And until then, we thank you all for listening.
You're welcome.
Thank you.